Hello everyone. Yes, I am Dante. This is Tori and this is Chloe. We are presenting today on exploring real-world horrors in genre fiction, conversion violence on trans and fat bodies in Gretchen Felker-Martin's Cuckoo. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on unceded Kaurna country here today. We acknowledge the traditional owners of these lands and would also like to extend that respect and acknowledgement to the First Nations peoples of other regions. Is that not? There we go.
Let me attach the mouse.
Oh, yeah, we have
Everybody ignore me. There we go.
You got it? Cool. All right.
So I'm going to open this little part of the presentation by reading a really short excerpt from Cuckoo. It is a two-part book with a time skip in the middle, and this is after the time skip when one of the main characters, John, is ruminating on one of the issues from their youth that has re-emerged. So, we could tell the governor, thought John. We could tell the police. We could tell child services. They weren't real thoughts. They'd had each one of those conversations 1,000 times in their youth. No one cared about a little reform farm for faggots. No one gave a shit what good, honest ranchers did to the sissies and dykes and the rest of the freaks. Fix them or fuck them, kill them or cure them. As long as it was quiet, who cared?
So Felker-Martin's Cuckoo follows a group of queer teens sent to Camp Resolution, a remote conversion camp in the desert of Utah, USA in 1995. The teens discover the camp is a feeding ground for the titular cuckoo, which is a monstrous creature that preys on vulnerable children and creates hyper-conformist doppelgangers in their place. Upon their discovery, the group orchestrate an escape from Camp Resolution, but in part two, but none escape entirely unscathed in this first part. And then in part two, 16 years later, in 2011, they are forced to reunite and finally confront their shared past once and for all. The earlier prologue of the book is set in 1991, the same year that vocal pseudoscientist Joseph Nicolosi published Reparative Therapy of Male Homosexuality, a new clinical approach. His text on reintegrative therapy techniques that we now know colloquially as conversion therapy. Nicolosi's texts focus not solely on homosexuality, but on perceived threats to masculinity and traditional gender roles, a view that aligned his work with the Christian right and their crusade against homosexuality, emasculation, and queer activism. This era of coalition between pseudo-psychoanalytic behavior, change, and religious opposition to queerness in their efforts to police non-normative behaviors forms the backdrop of Cuckoo's world and provides us with the setting of Camp Resolution. Before we get into the multiple types of horror within Cuckoo, it's important to establish why, in our opinion, the horror genre works so well here. Felker-Martin has noted that horror is all about unspoken drives, desires, and fears. You can push people into a space where they have to start questioning the architecture of their own mind and the world around them. It becomes a fruitful space to explore the insidious nature of normative ideologies, of what society has deemed acceptable. It also avoids sanitizing the queer narrative by not perpetuating it gets better trajectories, nor does it prioritize sympathetic readings from non-queer audiences. Bigotry, and more specifically the conversion practices enacted on its behalf at Camp Resolution, are framed as the source of the horror in the narrative. The violence, like the cuckoo, is the source of horror, described in visceral detail and often relating to bodies and bodily functions. The inherent abjection of body horror aligns the gargantuan monstrous cuckoo with the affront of bigotry, impossible to ignore. It provides both visual and sensorial effects that relate back to human leaders of Camp Resolution, amplifying their everyday cruelty to horror. Upon reading Cuckoo, we also found that the teens in the book felt notably real to us, presenting multiple intersections of identity and layers of complexity in their actions and beliefs. Notably, this diverse group of queer characters contributes to representation within the horror genre, which becomes particularly pertinent when considering the trans characters that have been imbued with realistic nuance. They offer a departure from the genre's historical mistreatment of trans feminine characters in particular, that have previously been pathologized and vilified in conventions set forth and perpetuated by examples like Norman Bates in Psycho and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. The benefit of multiple queer characters is the diversity and depth of representation it allows.
Another thing we want to touch on before we get right into talking about conversion violence is why we felt particularly moved to do so in this book through the writing of the intersectional queer teens that make up the bulk of the story. And there's this quote here from Ford and Herb that says, as a storytelling device, conversion camps provide a setting to center characters, bodies, and expressions that are generally marginalized or erased from traditional teen cinema and literature. Falcon Martin very purposefully uses both the setting of the conversion camp and teenagers as these main characters, and it becomes very believable within the setting of Camp Resolution, and it sets you up to do some really effective things with metaphor and allegory. Through multiple character perspectives, Cuckoo immerses the reader in the camp experience, and Falcon Martin forces us to only learn about the characters as they learn about each other, and they do so in very teenage ways. And in doing so, as a reader, you're mirroring their confusion and their trepidation with one another. As far as queer representation goes, the characters rarely label themselves explicitly. There are moments, and they're chosen very particularly. And we see this lack of labeling oneself as being reflective of both the adolescent process of formation, being, continually in flux and discovered, as well as acknowledging the collective lack of definition that they're provided in the camp. The fact is they're all labeled as queers, and the granulation of that doesn't matter to the people running the camp or ultimately the Cuckoo itself. And the book briefly touches on an older queer representation and some kinship through the character Joe's grandfather, who's referred to by all as OG. And there is a little slice in the book. It's not a major feature, but there's a slice in the book that speaks about OG's own queerness, and it makes sense as he is the only adult character that the teens can turn to once they make their escape from the camp. And so we are going to talk about two specific kinds of conversion violence within the book. And the first is trans conversion violence. So the violence against particularly trans and gender non-conforming bodies occurs immediately at Camp Resolution, with the camp split down binary lines of assigned sex at birth. Rigid gender roles are harshly and explicitly enforced, with the camp figurehead, Pastor Eddie, stating very early on in the teens' camp journey that they are there to learn how to be men, how to be women. The campers are ostensibly being wrangled into heteronormative and chrononormative lines, where the camp tries to make them cis and straight in their teenagehoods to ensure their future straight timelines and those associated milestones. Obviously, we've heard a lot about chrononormativity and Freeman's chrononormativity throughout this conference, but there is a particular hook in the fact that they are teenagers, and them going to conversion camp at this stage in their lives aligns with this idea that perhaps if they can be quote unquote cured or quote unquote fixed at this time, that they can still hit those heteronormative and chrononormative milestones like marriage and childbirth if they can be, again, cured in this present. So trans characters within the camp setting are consistently misgendered, and their gender expressions are pathologized and cast as deviance and confusion. For example, those who are assigned as boys in the camp have their heads forcibly shaved, and this includes the gender non-conforming Gabe and the trans girl Shelby, and it strips them of their gender expression in one of the earliest acts of explicit violence and control in the book. And as Bittner and co say, this attempt to control queer or deviant desires through physical actions is a violent act, in that the physical body is seen as susceptible to manipulation and change, hypothetically leading the way to inner changes. These moments of trans conversion and conversion violence, as we see it as a whole in this book, are not necessarily these explicit moments of telling these characters that they need to change or very explicitly labeling the acts of violence as conversion practices. It is an ongoing process that frankly, doesn't let up for once they're at the camp in part 1 of the book. And importantly, the camp also fosters an environment where campers are encouraged to police other campers' genders. Betty, a camper who has been made into something of an enforcer by camp staff, is a foremost example of this. She's seemingly gleeful at her position, and she undeniably has a hand in the violence that is doled out to her fellow campers. But it also becomes clear that she takes up this role to try and ensure her safety in the present. After all, Betty is still at Camp Resolution and is still a queer teen who we see actively wrestling with her queer desires. Betty uses violence, but is also constrained by it. And while Camp Resolution's conversion violence is most explicitly enacted around gender and sexuality, we argue that the same sort of regulation and control is also exerted upon the camp's fat bodies. So Camp Resolution imposes rigorous physical labour and exercise on the campers, as well as strictly controlling their food intake and making the food unappealing to eat. And these are impositions that particularly impact the fat characters. Now, this combined routine not only exhausts and weakens the campers, making them easier victims for the Cuckoo, but it particularly targets these fat characters and makes them the target of not only fatphobic and conversion violence, but also fatphobic rhetoric from the other campers and the workers of the camp. So for the fat campers, not only is Camp Resolution seeking to convert them to cis-het individuals, but also to thin ones. And McFarlane et al., as Sarah spoke about in her presentation earlier today, considers that fat bodies are always already positioned outside the normative timelines of straight life. And fatness presents a perceived barrier to that timeline. It's almost, I think, in terms of Ahmed's affects, it almost presents a blockage. And that's a really important and notable thing within the book. The fat campers, particularly Shelby, the trans feminine Shelby, and John, who is a fat gay boy, occupy a complex space where they are simultaneously subject to fat phobia, but also objects of desire and envy in their fat bodies. And while it's important to acknowledge that jealousy and desire do not negate the violence that these fat characters experience, they do provide a point from which we seek to examine the way that Cuckoo complicates lines of oppression and liberation and challenges the notions of straightforward resistance.
And what we find particularly interesting about this novel as an example of conversion therapy fiction is that, unlike many of the other fictional conversion narratives that we've come across, where victims have more of a passive response to what is put onto them, because of Gretchen Felker-Martin's use of horror, we're able to respond to this violence with violence. And we see this at the end of the different parts of the novel. And so these teens are able to directly resist the conformativity that is placed upon them. Some of the ways that we also see resistance is through the everyday interactions between these characters. We have the cisgender lesbian main character Nadine, who shows attraction to and has a relationship with, as we've just mentioned before, the trans feminine fat character Shelby. And these are never seen as attempts to, Nadine is never wavered by the attempts of the members of the camp to misgender Shelby or shrink and convert her. And Nadine unwaveringly sees Shelby as the girl that she is. We also see that after enduring the conversion violence of the camp, Gabe still realizes her gender identity through a simple, powerful, and internal event. So despite their expectedly teenage interpersonal squabbles, the kinship of the group of queer teens is what allows them to escape from Camp Resolution. And so this brings me to, sorry, let me pause for a moment. This brings me to thinking about the way that sacrifice is repeated within the novel. So in the escape from the camp, Joy lets another camper, Brady, die to save herself, and Nadine sacrifices herself to allow the rest of the group to get away. The characters are not magically healed by their escape. In fact, 16 years later, we intimately see the lasting effects of their trauma from said escape and their time at the camp. In the years since their escape, the characters have largely grown distant from one another, having experienced further loss, and have all developed different opinions regarding the Cuckoo and their camp stay. The sharp turn from the group of teens escaping at the end of part 1 to their relative estrangement in the part 2 time jump further complexifies often linear narratives of connection over time. And so in part 2, we come back to the group and we learn that Nadine's youngest trans sister, Abby, is now being taken from a new iteration of Camp Resolution. That Nadine's parents, having lost their child due to them sending her away to this dangerous place, have certainly not learned their lesson and are forcing that violence again on their daughter, Abby. And so the group that we've come to follow for this book did resolve that they have to defeat the monster once and for all. And so several characters have evolved quite opposite personalities in part 2. Take, for example, Felix, one of the main characters, who in part 1 of the story is very much like, if I keep my head down, I can survive this camp and I can come out the other side and I can live my queer future away once I have bared through this trauma. That being said, when we see Felix later, he instead is actively seeking out the cuckoo to defeat it. In part 2, it has to convince the people who have escaped to join him. These characters resist what Catherine von Stockton calls the, quote, vertical forward motion metaphor of growing up, end quote. So Cuckoo gestures towards the potential and hope for queer futurity in part 2, with the characters attempting to make the future better for Abby, continuing the cycle of fighting for their rights as marginalised queer folk. The narrative of Cuckoo itself becomes cyclical, with Joe and Lara sacrificing themselves, much like we saw with Nadine in part 1.
So ultimately for us, this is a project that's kind of still in motion. We're constantly kind of discovering new things and new directions that we want to go, because it is a novel that is chock full of these complicated and complex kind of queer relationships, both with genre, with, the age of them, the teenagers that age up, but focusing on this, the kind of chrononormativity and what they, these teens end up resisting, though in very messy and not neat ways. There's no like neat bow that is tied at the end of this book. Ultimately, the ending is very ambiguous. So we see Abby, who ends up being saved from the camp, who is at a pride parade with a couple of the, grown-up teens from the original iteration of Camp Resolution. And the cuckoo, the titular monster, has they're not sure it's been defeated. And so the way that it creates doppelgangers, Abby is looking around wondering if perhaps the cuckoo is still out there and is perhaps at that very pride parade. And so this cyclical nature of both the narratives in the book, but also speaking to this cyclical nature of queer fights and the fact that it is not some linear path, as we are, I think, aggressively and terrifyingly aware of right now. Particularly for trans folks, I think is very important to say, that there is this cyclical nature of, it is not just one endpoint where it all gets better, but it is a continuing fight. And so ultimately, through the use of multiple perspectives, themes of found family, resilience, and trauma, and importantly, the cyclical nature of queer survival and sacrifice, Falcon Martin offers an allegory for queer experiences living in a heteronormative world. Cuckoo makes explicit the violence of prejudiced ideologies enacted on bodies through its utilization of horror conventions. The titular monster's mirroring of anti-queer bigotry controls and subjugates the campers via conversion practices promoting gender rigidity and thinness, and ultimately normativity, both chrono and heteronormativity. This is particularly notable for the fat and trans characters in the expected yet rarely told ways that multiple forms of oppression intersect. And ultimately, what we're gesturing towards right now, that will continue evolving as these things do, is that the traumatized survivors of Camp Resolution cannot progress towards a typical, normal, straight adult life, but they continue to gesture towards the hope for a queer future. Thanks so much, everyone. These are our references, and thank you for watching.